Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and I hope you're having a fantastic week, and really thank you so much for hitting that play button and listening in to today's episode of the Art of Procurement. Well, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome today's guest, who is Dr. Robert Handfield, to the show. Rob has such a deep background, it's honestly difficult to know where to start. So he is the Bank of America University Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at the North Carolina State University's Poole College of Management. Rob's also the founder and director of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative that's based out of Poole College at NC State, where he partners with leaders across industry to provide opportunities for students to undertake real-world projects across a number of different Fortune 500 companies. Also, Rob's a prolific writer on both procurement and supply chain issues. He's a consulting editor at the Journal of Operations Management, and he's authored several books on the topic, including one with Gerard Chick, who featured in episode 22 of The Art of Procurement. And actually, Rob and Gerard's book, which was The Procurement Value Proposition, that was awarded the Procurement Book of the Year in a prestigious award ceremony in Paris last year. And Rob and I met for the first time earlier this year, and he immediately graciously accepted my invite to join me on the show. What we talk about today is why analytics are really becoming an essential procurement capability, what impact this has on the skills that we need, and also how real-time and predictive analytics are going to enable us to make smarter decisions related to our supply base and also make our interactions with our suppliers more data-based rather than, trying to use competitive leverage and kind of the buyer-seller power paradigm. Before we go into the show, I did just want to let you know, as I mentioned, episode 51, we just raced past 50, and to celebrate that milestone, that half-century mark, I've actually published a new report, and it went out on Friday for the first time. It's called The 50 Lessons I Learned from the First 50 Shows, and in it, I share a lesson and a prominent quote that really stood out to me from each one of the shows that we've had on the Art of Procurement so far. So if you'd like to read what I've taken from some of the key learnings that I've taken from the interviews that we've conducted so far on the show, just pop on over to artofprocurement.com/50 lessons. That's artofprocurement.com/50 lessons. All right then, well, let's roll the tape. As I mentioned in my introduction, I'm really honoured today to be joined by Rob Handfield. So Rob, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Well, my first question is one that I actually ask most guests on the show, and that is, did you choose supply chain and procurement as a career, or is it something that you kind of stumbled into and that it chose you?
Well, it was a bit of a stumble into it, actually. My undergraduate degree was statistics and operations research, and I had operated a business in the summers, a contracting business. Mm-hmm. So I sort of wanted something that would combine the two, and I went off to do a PhD at the University of North Carolina. And during the course of it, I became less interested in the operations research side and much more interested in the supply chain. And actually did my dissertation on purchasing and the role of purchasing in cycle time reduction. And so it was a combination of I think, very fortunate series of events that led me to that. And one of the people, my advisor, Ron Panisi, was a big person in influencing me in that direction as well.
So it's good to hear that you still talk about it being a positive thing. And now you've had a career in supply chain.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's a fascinating area. I think it combines a lot of different elements, mathematics and business and finance and relationships and negotiation, and it has so many different aspects of it, which makes it really such a fascinating area to study.
I know that you're pretty prolific in terms of your writing, both on supply chain and procurement and purchasing. I wondered what continued to motivate you to do this, because from personal experience, I know how time-consuming that can be.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things I learned very early on when I did my dissertation is I studied cycle times, and I went out to manufacturing sites and met with people, and I just found it fascinating talking to people and learning what they were doing in their role in the supply chain, and that continued to motivate me. I think as I continue to learn. I spend a lot of time with executives at conferences, at meetings, and as I learn more, I continue to. I have a blog, scm.ncsu.edu/blog, and I'm constantly writing on what I'm seeing, and I think it's that continuous learning cycle, that's enabled by talking to people that really makes it interesting.
No, a lot of people that I talk to on the show are. They highlight the importance of continuous learning, that this isn't something that, you get your degree and then you kind of stop. The ability to continually take in new content and a shift and adapt as things around us change is one of the things that really helps you grow in your career.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
In your role of as professor of supply chain management at North Carolina State, I know that you obviously come into contact with a lot of students who are making the decision to choose supply chain and procurement as a career. I think for a lot of us, like you, I stumbled into the profession too. So I wondered, what is it that attracts them to study supply chain? What is it about the profession that is interesting to them to choose it as a career?
One word, Philip: pizza.
Right.
So, no, seriously, that's actually. Most students, when they come into a business school and they take their first supply chain class, they really know nothing about it. Right. And so one of the things that we do is we created a supply chain club, and we literally say, okay, free pizza, and students show up for the free pizza, of course, and then we typically will have, an industry speaker or someone that will be talking about what they're seeing, what their job is, someone from Caterpillar or someone from Revlon or someone from Toshiba, who works in a major distribution center, who works in a manufacturing plant. And it opens up a whole new world to these kids. They've never known that there's, they've never thought about where their products come from or where their laptop comes from or where their coffee comes from. And so for them, it realizes that, if they're good at finance, if they're good at, thinking operationally, if they're interested in working with people, suddenly it's a very good profession. And of course, the other thing that attracts them is there's a huge demand right now for supply chain talent. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the undergraduates and the MBAs in our program are attracted. I mean, starting salaries for MBAs are around $80,000, and undergraduates is about $50,000. So it's highly lucrative, and that certainly has an appeal. We don't encourage that for them to join that major for that reason, but it certainly does make it more appealing.
So what's driving that demand then?
Well, what's driving that demand is we live more and more in an outsourced world, yeah. And as we've outsourced more, suddenly we realize we still have to manage that. And even though a lot of the manufacturing jobs have gone overseas, we still need people to manage logistics, distribution, to work in, and especially in procurement. There's a huge demand for people to work as buyers, associate buyers, category managers. We have a lot of students going into roles as analysts around building market intelligence, building cost models, and that there's a huge demand now for all of a sudden for students who have this ability to analyze large amounts of data and also unstructured data in markets, and who can make sense of it and can make decisions based on that.
So this may be a good segue into a question I had on your curriculum, and talking about how things are changing. What are some of the key shifts that you see that you teach, say today versus 5 years ago, that are a result of some of these changes that are happening to our profession? Well,
yeah, exactly. And I think, the single word I would say there is analytics. Mm-hmm. We're seeing a big demand for young people who can work with large data sets, and not so much just crunch numbers, but also to be able to make sense of those numbers. And And part of what we do in our curriculum is we have students work on projects with companies. They do a 3-credit, 15-week practicum at both the undergraduate and the MBA level. And as part of that, they're given data sets that they have to work with. And
Right.
the first thing they realize is, wow, this is horrible data, and it's typically in a format which is in the number one software used in supply chains, which is Excel, right?
Right.
And so they're given these massive Excel, sheets full of data, and they have to make sense out of it and analyze it and come forth with some insight. So they have to cleanse it, they have to go through it, they have to look at what's going on. In some cases, they have to augment it with additional analysis through interviews, and to be able to produce a report of some sort that gives some directive. And I think this is, this combination of analytics, but being able to derive insight
Right.
from data is, and even unstructured data, market data. You going and knowing where to look for research in online databases that you can find information on a category or a cost model, and being able to produce something that is useful. That is the skill set that we're seeing in every sector, in financials, industrials, pharmaceuticals. Every sector is looking for people with those kinds of skills.
So as the data becomes available, it's making it actionable.
Exactly, and the actionable piece is really important. And I think there's a distinguishing feature between a data scientist, someone who just is a sort of a quant who can crunch numbers, and someone who then can not only do that but then also be able to say, well, I'm going to have to present this to a group of people and make recommendations as a result of that in terms of what the action should be. And I think that's where the second skill I would say is problem solving. And relationship management. You have to be able to convince people, to influence people that your decision, that your approach is the right one. And using data, using analytics to make your point and to support your recommendations is key. And I think that's something that procurement has not done a very good job of in the past. We've been, we stand on our high horse and pound our fists on the table, but until we have actual data and analysis to support our points, we're not going to get very far.
No, it's much easier to build business cases or gain leverage or negotiate based on data and fact than it is on essentially, being the biggest, the 800-pound gorilla in the room and just telling people what you want.
Well, that's right, and also, most people really don't care about procurement. For most people, they look at procurement, they say, "What's the big deal? Just go out and buy it." And that's their point of view. They don't understand, our world, our vernacular when we talk about spend analytics and category management and total cost of ownership. I mean, these terms mean nothing to most people, and yet we assume that we can just throw them around and people are going to fall in line. That's not the case. It's almost like presenting a case to a jury. You have to be able to support and buttress your case with facts, with data, to win them over and to get them onto your side.
And so some of those technical skills that we used to focus on, are those becoming less important? The ability to drive process, drive compliance, those kind of things?
Well, I think those things are still there. I think they're important for organizations that are sort of in an early stage of maturity. For instance, it's important that you have a source-to-pay or a procure-to-pay system where you do have compliance and you do have to map out your processes. We had a student team work with a large insurance company, MetLife, and did just that this semester, did an end-to-end process map of their source-to-pay system. And that, identified a number of areas where there were gaps, where there were issues. And as you find those gaps, you can improve the process and you can drive it out. But I think source to pay is increasingly becoming a much more automated activity. And we have a lot of technology and tools that can support that. And so I think as those problems go away, then the higher order problems require a different set of skills.
Right. And the work that you did with MetLife, and you mentioned a couple of other examples, is that part of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative?
Exactly, yes. And we work with a number of companies. Others include John Deere, Caterpillar, Novozymes. We work with the American Red Cross. We work with Merck and Biogen. And again, these are all companies in very different industrial sectors. Right. They have different hotspots and different contexts. But what we find is that the fundamental skills around procurement, sourcing, supply chain are very, very similar across these different industries. Mm-hmm. And that, therefore, it is something that can be taught. And you have to contextualize it, and that's where the projects help people understand what's happening in this industry. What are the regulatory issues you have to deal with in pharma or in financial services, and how does that change the process? How does it change the strategy? But the fundamental approach that you use to develop those strategies remains the same. Well,
okay, great. Well, I'm going to link to details of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative in the show notes for today, so that if anyone's listening is interested, they know where to go to find out a little bit more. So the main topic for today of conversation that we talked about before, and that we kind of mentioned when we were a couple of minutes ago, there is the role that data is going to play for procurement professionals. And I think specifically when we think about predictive analytics, my first question around that is, kind of what's the burning platform? Why is it now important? And why do procurement professionals need to be thinking more about data and data-driven kind of information?
Well, and I think it goes back to, the earlier point that we made, which is that, procurement really hasn't had, procurement for a long time really hasn't had a very good foundation to stand on, that they spend a lot of time sort of frustrated, complaining they don't have a seat at the table, mm-hmm. and they're not really driving value. And that's actually a theme that Gerard Chick and I also wrote about in our procurement value proposition, that, the world is different. The world has changed. There are many different things going on in terms of sustainability and in terms of the global economics moving more to the east. And very often, procurement, when they try to get a seat at the table, so to speak, to build strategy, they're impeded because they have a lack of credibility. Mm-hmm. And that is fundamentally due to a lack of metrics, a lack of data, and the resulting absence of a business case. And so, when that happens, then whether it's a lack of data or their inability to anticipate and gather the data, this causes significant challenges for them to be able to really connect and have a discussion around sourcing analytics and risk and lifecycle management, market intelligence, all the things that they can do to support executives. So the study that we did with IBM this past year, we interviewed 25 senior executives, and we asked them, what are the things that is going to take to really build an analytical platform, mm-hmm. and which comes first in a sense? Is it procurement doesn't have a business case, or the lack of a systems to build the analytics that's required to get sort of the insight and the credibility, and it became a chicken and egg argument, because they said, well, we can't do anything because we have poor systems. Well, having poor systems is no longer an excuse, and because what we found is that even organizations that don't have cleanse master data, contract management systems, are still able to use data to their advantage to be able to create analytical insights that can support procurement transformation and engagement with stakeholders.
So what are some of the ways that they do that? Because I'm sure a lot of listeners are listening to this and kind of nodding their head in terms of not having access to great data. So if you don't have access to that good data, how are companies kind of making use of what they do have to start at least driving the transformation discussion?
Right. So, what we did is we came up, we discovered, and we call it a process that we call innovative data leveraging. Mm-hmm. And this process is one that we've discovered is really critical for creating this analytical insight. And this is a fact-based, data-driven approach to driving change, influencing stakeholders to create value for the business. And the common thread when we did these case studies was that This engagement began with a deep relationship, a deep set of discussions with stakeholders to really, really understand what are their business problems. And once you understand, the business problem or the business issue, then you can start to say, well, what is the question you're really trying to answer? Again, that may sound simplistic, but you have to really dig and find out, what is the ideal analytical insight? What kind of data would you like to look at? How is it a historical insight? Is it real time? Is it a trend? Is it a forecast? Help me understand, what information, what data would help you address your business challenge or your business problem. And then you can actually go out and say, okay, well, let's go out there and try to find data. And if we don't have the data today, let's go out and collect it. And maybe we can collect it from sources that we don't have internal to the company. Maybe it's external. But maybe we have actually latent information and other data that can at least give us insights into directionally what's happening in this area and create some initial platforms. And I think the key assumption that people trip over is they say, well, we don't have systems, we don't have data. Well, actually, you do have data. Mm-hmm. But as we said earlier, it's probably in an Excel spreadsheet on someone's desktop. And it's not in a system. And in fact, the information you need doesn't have to be produced by an ERP system or a SAP system or Oracle or anything else. Very often it's information that you can collect on customer data, on country data, on risk data that you can use to create insights. And the key here is, I'd much rather have a little bit of relatively accurate, relevant data than 100 pounds of garbage produced right. from an ERP system that doesn't really help you very much. So I think that's the key is you have to be a little creative and curious and you have to be able to be a problem solver mm-hmm. to use this approach. And
target it around very specific problems rather than, it gets very overwhelming very quickly when you start thinking about, I need to do this for my entire sourcing organization. Where do you start? But if you're targeting it around a business problem, then you can use that as kind of a use case to hopefully then drive investment as well in what might be a broader approach.
Exactly right. And as a statistician, I also know that, you can use sampling theory. You don't have to have the entire population. If you go with a subsample or if you collect, a sample of invoices or a sample of purchase orders or, a sample of bills of lading from supplier shipments, you can understand, and at least what is the data telling you, and is it showing a pattern? Is it distributed evenly? What is the data telling you that can help inform the business problem or the business issue that your stakeholder mm-hmm. is dealing with? And, that's very different than financial reporting. I think it's important not to get this confused with financial reporting. When you start looking at, financial reporting around cost of goods sold, yes, that's something that you need to use a system. But for, engaging stakeholders in business problems, not so much.
So do you have examples of use cases from an organizational perspective of, what are some of the problems that are out there that you can start to think about solving with more predictive analytics?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's many cases. I think you can think of them in terms of looking at spend, building different types of cost models. Mm-hmm. Or in fact, even looking at your current contracts and relationships. So, for instance, one thing that we see is companies want to know, well, how much are we spending with minority and diverse suppliers? So that's something you can get into the spend data. You can code it. You can understand it. You can talk to people. You can get insights on that. Another example might be, say, a capacity analysis.
Yeah.
We had a set of students that was working with a large biotech company, and they had a number of products in the pipeline, and they asked the question, well, if all these products do hit, come to fruition, what will be the capacity bottlenecks within the supply base? And so they were able to run, some, fairly innovative simulation analysis to identify, if all these things came to fruition and the demand was X, then the API requirements would be Y, and these suppliers would potentially be the bottleneck. So they would need to find other sources of supply. One that was very interesting, I thought, was a financial services company that said they had a challenge where their CFO said, how do we know that the savings you're getting for us on these contracts are actually, impacting our bottom line, are actually going to savings? That's a very typical type of problem that procurement is faced with. So what they did is they said, let's actually look at this at the contract level. And every time they did a deal, they looked at what they call delta P, delta V. So they looked at the change in the price, the delta P, for not just the end price, but the labor, the paint, if it was a painting contract, the cost of the paint, the cost of the labor, and then the delta V, the volume that was purchased as well. So were they, how much were they buying, and how many hours of labor, and how many gallons of paint, and we're able to calculate on a very granular level, on a contract-by-contract basis, what the actual savings was on that contract, and presented that to the CFO so he could see for himself what the actual cost savings derived over the previous year was for that particular category of spend. So it's those kinds of, you have to be a little more granular. You have to really look at this at a much more fundamental level than what you have in the past. And I think it can be done. It can be done if you're willing to, if you have people who can invest the time and the effort. I think that's the key. The key is if you don't have people, then it's very difficult to be able to address these issues. So you need to have people who are dedicated to analytics who can solve these kinds of problems.
So you think it's more about the people than it is about the systems and the tools to extract the data?
Absolutely. I think companies have data in all different places, and you have to be a bit of a detective to find out, okay, where's the data and who has it and who runs this operation and what data do they have and what information do they have and can I utilize it and can I get access to it and can I get it in a form where I can use it? Now, that's not to say you're going to be successful in every case. You may run into a situation where you say, gosh, we absolutely have no data. So then you need to say, well, let's get creative. I mean, what are some other insights I can derive that can be useful and maybe a proxy for this data that could be useful as a way to think about what is going on here. For instance, we worked with a large utility company, Duke Energy, and we had a group of students look at the variation in energy consumption, and they came up with a forecast for the variation in energy consumption as a function of temperature and housing starts and other factors. And then we're able to link inventory consumption to the energy consumption. And so we're able to better predict, how much inventory they're going to need for different kinds of transformers and different kinds of, electric utility components based on the variation in energy usage, which again they would try to predict using other data.
And have you seen use cases in the indirect space? I know that energy is, and that tied back to something that's more supply chain related. But I'm interested when you think about when you think about things that are specifically indirect procurement purchases. I'm imagining you can use the same logic to apply to other types of buys.
Yeah, actually, there are some areas of indirect, and people say, well, we don't have any data on indirect, or we don't have ownership of it, and I think that's an area where there's certainly work to be done. I mean, software, for instance, is one that people often don't think about, but if you think of it, software in your company probably, it's driven by the number of users and the number of user licenses. And what you typically find is you don't even have an inventory of users and user licenses for, Microsoft Office even. And just going around and understanding that data and how many licenses you have can be a very interesting exercise to tell you, what your actual requirements are. The same with travel, being able to look at travel vouchers and travel for different parties in the organization, and even coming up with a common set of policies that can drive travel requirements is a major win in most companies, and it can drive huge amounts of savings. Even the paper today, there was something that showed how, for business flyers, if you fly now multiple cities on the same segment, you're going to pay almost double or triple what you would by getting those flights individually. So, there's all kinds of things like that you can think about to use data and to drive significant cost savings just by being clever and by looking at it differently.
And so how are companies using it? And thinking of a couple of other areas that I know I hear a lot about, and that you talked about actually in when you presented on this topic at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and that's around price volatility and supply risk.
So when you think about price volatility, I mean, you're thinking about what are the drivers for price, and what are the things that could impact price. And when you start to think about those elements, you can think about time of year, you can think about cyclical patterns, even looking at the longer term issues like price of oil, price of commodities. And I think the fact is, we're in a period of very, very low prices across the board for oil, for commodities.
Yeah.
Even yesterday and this week, there's been signs that oil prices are creeping back up because of supply constraints, which are starting to emerge. Likewise, commodities are likely to creep back up as well. So we're in a period of very low prices, but I think it's important to recognize that we need to understand the signals that will indicate prices are ready to go back up. The other thing, of course, is with supplier risk.
Right.
People think of risk as just financial risk, right? We have to, as long as we look at the financial indicators, right, we're in good shape. Unfortunately, and this is even another study we did, we found that the correlation of the Dun & Bradstreet indicators for a particular disruption, this is at one company, for a supply disruption was almost completely uncorrelated to the incidence of disruption, which suggests that financial risk is not the only, and very often not a good predictor of disruptions, which means you have to look at other things. You have to look at labor rate. You have to look at performance. You have to look at capacity. You have to look at whether the supplier has changed ownership. So you really need to start having a lot more information about who your suppliers are and what's happening to them. And this is sort of an area where I think there's some emerging technologies, especially cognitive technologies, that can start to, look at structured and unstructured data and can give you, more information about what's happening in your supply base, what are particular suppliers that you need to be monitoring, and also understanding, which suppliers, if they go down, right, and which categories, if there's a problem, could shut down your company. And they call that kill shot analysis. Not a very nice term, but what's the source? What part of your supply chain can literally shut you down and drive and impact your revenue? And those are the ones especially where you need to focus your effort. And I think analytics can help you figure that out.
Yeah, and I've had personal experience of putting in programs to do that on the financial services side where it's actually regulated. So financial services companies are probably a little bit ahead of the game in terms of the different types of risk that they are monitoring, managing, mitigating against, that I think definitely other industries have things to learn. As you say, it's more than just financial risk management. But there's something that you said there about the automation piece, because there really is so much data that's involved that needs to be monitored to pick up on like little nuances that are predictors of risk, that it becomes overwhelming for you to do that manually. So do you see technology coming that's going to take over that burden, or is it still going to be kind of a mix of people and technology?
Yeah, I really believe it's a mix of people and technology. And, we have a number of doctoral students that are working on, natural language-based processing and machine learning that will go out and obviously use keywords to look at what's happening out there in the outside world. What we find is that you almost always need some level of human curation to combine with that level of automation. You need to have some level of human activity that can monitor what's happening and be able to make sense of it and be able to connect it to, connect events to particular parts of your supply chain. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly, there are technologies that can show you what suppliers are in the vicinity of a major disruption, whether it's a volcano or a hurricane or what have you. But it's always has to be interpreted in context. I mean, machines aren't smart enough yet to be able to pinpoint, where it's going to impact you, how it's going to impact you, what steps need to be taken. They can certainly help you by providing you with additional data and insight that you can then act on. But it is a combination, and I think there's a curation piece that will always sort of be there.
We talked at the beginning of the show about the inflection point that procurement's at when you think about providing value over and above just trying to lever spend. So I'm interested, when you start to look into your crystal ball, what kind of predictions do you have in terms of the impact that predictive analytics could have on procurement?
Well, I think where we're headed is predictive analytics, but also analytics that are real time. Mm-hmm. I think we need to if we have real time information, then we can be much more predictive. And the analogy is, if you don't want your speedometer to tell you how fast you were going 5 minutes ago or how fast you were going last week, we have to move from a batch to a real time view of what's happening in our supply chains, and only then can we start to be more predictive in terms of understanding what's going to happen, and less probabilistic. I think the probabilistic models aren't very good. I think when we start doing that, then we can also monitor what's happening on projects through workflow systems. Instead of managing risk, we're actually seeing what's happening with our suppliers in real time. We're communicating with them, that we're connected with digitization and mobile computing and cloud computing. Literally, we can be connected all the time to our key suppliers and understand what's happening and be in communication with them. But as this capability emerges, again, you need individuals who have this combination of being able to rapidly understand data, but also have engineering and business capability who know what to do with it and know what actions to take. Mm-hmm. And along with that, we also need, I think, we start thinking about corporate responsibility. And we need to have partners who are also okay with being transparent, with telling us and showing us exactly what's happening, even though it may be ugly, even though it may be out of compliance. We need to know about it, and we need to have partners who can tell us when there's an issue or a problem and be transparent about it, and we can fix the problem.
So that's a big jump as well, isn't it? For in a world where we typically hold all of our cards close to our chest, and our supply base does as well. It takes a lot to change that model.
It really does, and I think the barriers are more psychological and around psychological and trust based, as opposed to analytics and technology based. I think the analytics and the systems are there today, but I think the mindset is not there today to think about ourselves as being connected in this sense to a single network that's creating value for the end customer. And we have to think in terms of, the end goal, which is we all have to share information if we're all going to, succeed in this end-to-end network.
Right.
And we have to work together to a common objective, common goal. And it's really a different way of working, and it's a very different approach than I think we've seen in the past. Even 5 years ago, I think procurement was really about cost models and clean sheeting and tough negotiations. I think today we're looking at not cost is still important, but we have to think about this end-to-end value that we can create as well.
When organizations start thinking about wanting to build capabilities that enable them to do these things, where do they start?
Right. So I think there's a few things that people today need to think about. Number one, they need to think about a talent strategy.
Yeah.
You need to think about bringing in individuals who are comfortable with, in working with data, comfortable in working with mobile cloud computing solutions. And I think a lot of young people we're seeing today have those skill sets that really are comfortable in working in that environment. And can start to think about those approaches. At the same time, I think you have to think about talent in terms of the transference of knowledge from the people that are retiring, that are leaving the company, and combining their intangible knowledge with the skills of maybe the analytical generation that's coming in as well today. I think that the second thing is you need to think about, what are the opportunities I have to engage with stakeholders, with different functions, and what are the problems they're facing, and how can I help them with those problems, and how can I bring to bear teams to focus on specific problems with those businesses that may not be directly related to pursuing immediate objectives, but which are important to our stakeholders, which I think can then eventually help us achieve those objectives in the end. And I think that's where procurement falls down today. They don't do that very well. And I guess the third part of it is, we have to think about supplier management, and how do we find the right partners? How do we segment our supply base to find and focus on the right suppliers? What's the current state of the relationships with these suppliers? Are we measuring performance? Are we having those discussions with them to say, these are the expectations, and we need to work together to these solutions? And what ideas do you have that can help us with our business and with our problems? Now, they're a core element of the solution. We need to tap into the knowledge, the intellectual capital of our suppliers, and reach out to them to help us through this as well. We can't do it alone, and I think that's a huge resource that is typically overlooked in a lot of organizations I work with.
So I just have one last question. We've come to the end of the show. Unfortunately, time is always the enemy on these interviews that I do. I'm just interested to know, if listeners are interested in learning more. We talked about the supply chain resource cooperative, and we talked about your blog, but is there any other information you'd like to direct listeners to? And I'll be sure to link those up in the show notes.
Yeah, so I would certainly refer people to my book I wrote with Gerard Schick, The Procurement Value Proposition. We talk a lot about these kinds of things. We have a white paper we wrote with IBM on procurement analytics, and my blog has obviously a lot of information on this as well. And we also have another paper, The Future Procurement, we wrote with KPMG, that could be of interest as well. But I would welcome any comments people have to my blog or otherwise, and you can always email me. I'm online at ncsu.edu. Thank you.
Great. Well, what I will do is I'll make sure that I link up to those in the notes that accompany the episode today. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/predictive analytics. That's artofprocurement.com/predictive analytics. So with that being said, Rob, I want to thank you again very much for joining me on the show. I think this is it's truly a fascinating subject that has the potential to really transform how we work with stakeholders, how we bring value to them, and really how we start making decisions based on data. Decisions based on actionable data rather than gut feel, which honestly I think is a lot of what we do, and using leverage. So I think there's definitely more to come in this space. So Rob, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being here, Philip. Take care.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.